This is a 70s Super Reverb that just came in, and it is a particularly well-timed amp because I have begun the research for the upcoming big video on amps under $1,000. Notice I don't call it best amps under $1,000. I cannot say that any one amp is the best amp, but they will all be very good choices. While doing the research for that video, one of the criteria I was looking at was what vintage amps are available on the market under $1,000. And when it came to vintage Fenders, pretty much what pops up are mid to late 70s twins and super reverbs, generally the ones with the master volumes. Interestingly, the same period deluxe reverbs, Vibrolux reverbs, Princeton reverbs are not available under $1,000. Right now they are more desirable, I assume because of the smaller size and lower volumes. So those are over $1,000 right now. But you can get a super reverb or twin reverb, much like this one. The photo galleries in the online listings rarely show the inside of the chassis, so you don't really know what you're going to get. When it comes to the 70 super reverbs, you can see from the listings that some have ceramic speakers like these, some have Alnicos. On paper, the Alnicos are more desirable, but it's going to depend on whether the speakers work or not. It's very common to have bad voice coils or tears in the cones. When you pick up an amp in person to buy it, potentially, that's one of the things to check for. You can get a flashlight and look through the grill cloth from one side, and you can do the same thing from the other. If you see flashlight coming from the front through the back, you've got a hole in the cone, or if it sounds terrible. Anyway, we're going to open this amp up and see what one might find inside one of those listings for a Fender from this period. Generally going to be super reverbs and twins, the big bad boys, as far as weight and size and volume. But they can be really good choices. Let's take a look inside this one. We're going to pretend that you watched that amps under $1,000 video that I'll be doing sometime in the next week, and that in that video I said this might be a good amp for you to look at, and you bought one, or you've shown up to check it out before you buy it, which would be better. I'm going to show you two things to check before you even try to take the whole thing apart to look inside. Number one, yep, this is common. These red plug power cables that they come with from the 70s, it's very common for the rubber insulation to degrade. Let me get this to focus. And once that rubber degrades, the insulation pulls out of that red plug, and then you have the inner wires beginning to be exposed and to have strain. Some people will snip this off and put a new plug on the end. You can get them for about $5 at Home Depot. That's not a good idea, if possible, to use that because it's a screw-on connector. It's not going to be as rugged. It's better to replace the power cable. Now, a new power cable costs, $10 to $20, and to have it installed, most techs would probably charge 1 hour of labor to do that. It's not that expensive, and it's really worthwhile. But this is going to be unsafe because, I'm sorry, the meter keeps beeping. It's under my left elbow. It's not going to be safe. Over time, that's going to strain. Something's going to break. Something's going to fray. And that's really common on 70s Fenders. The other thing to look at, which is why I have the meter under my elbow, is you can disconnect the speaker plug, and you can measure it if you have an ohm meter. And these four speakers together measure 2.4 ohms. That's good. We should be getting 2 ohms with 4 10-inch speakers in a super reverb. In a twin, you'd be getting 4 ohms. In a deluxe reverb, you'd be getting 8 ohms, etc. You need to know what to measure. That means that all 4 of these speakers are at least not open or not shorted. That doesn't mean they all sound good, but it can tell you an awful lot right off the bat. So now let me get this out of the chassis. We'll take a look at some other things. Oh, one last thing here. You can also look at the power tubes and see if one is darker than the other. It means it gets gotten too hot, or if either have gone white at one end, which means it's lost vacuum. The same thing happens with preamp tubes as far as going white if they lose vacuum, but that's a much less expensive proposition than power tubes. And if one of them is white and the amp's been used with just one, there may be a problem with that socket. If one of them is really darker than the others, there may be problems with that socket. So something to keep an eye on. Before I open it up, I want to point out 2 things. First of all, the only difference on the front panel between these era Fenders and the previous ones are the addition of a master volume. Now the master volume falls into 2 categories. There are the earlier amps which just have a master volume, and these later ones which have a master volume that's also a push-pull boost. The master volume generally sounds quite nice, the boost not so much. The other difference that you find, and I'm not sure what year this started, the pre-72 amps have the baffles screwed to cleats inside the cabinets. And that's good if there's a problem with the baffle, because it's just particle board. You can replace the baffle easily. Starting in 72, they went to having the baffle dadoed into the cabinet. It's the same particle board baffle. If when that particle board breaks, it's more difficult to change the baffle. You have to have someone cut it out flush to the sides and install cleats to put a new replacement baffle on. Later in the 70s, like on this one, there's that same baffle, but the grill cloth is not attached to the baffle. The grill cloth is attached to a frame, which is then Velcroed to the baffle. So this one's in pretty good shape, but a lot of the ones from the 70s, the frame itself warps and pulls off of the baffle. So that's something to look at. I could probably grab this with my thumbnail and just pull it out. But this is in good shape. It's not going to be an issue, but some of them, it can be a problem. You can actually kind of steam them back more or less flat, and you can replace the old Velcro with new Velcro or dual lock. There are fixes, but it's not really as nice as the ones back when the grill cloth was on the actual baffle. And again, the earlier amps with the screwed-in baffle are preferable for that reason. The chassis doesn't want to come out of this one. It's binding right in this area. So I'm going to take this tool. You can use a putty knife or a table knife and just kind of work it through here. I think it's binding to a Tolex flap. I'm not touching the chassis. I'm not touching the chassis. There it goes. It was just stuck to, oh, someone put some little strip of something like a foam adhesive down there. It was stuck to the middle of that chassis, and the chassis did not want to come out. So I did not damage the chassis, and I did not damage the cab or the Tolex. This is a little thin thing. Apparently my wife got it at IKEA. It's a dough cutter. But, you know, anything flat and small that you don't mind getting a little bit of adhesive funk on will do the job. Here we can see a little bitty minor indentation in the faceplate. That's no big deal. That can be pressed out if you're willing to do a lot of work, but it doesn't hurt a thing. It's got tubes labeled Lindell. I don't know anything about them other than they're probably relatively old. Interesting that they're clear at this end. There's no flashing at all, but they probably have not lost vacuum. All three transformers in this amp are from 1978, going by the date codes. You can look up how to read date codes on transformers. I can't put every bit of information in every video. This amp's either a 78 or a 79, but the transformers are from 78. Which brings us to the doghouse and what may lurk beneath. We'll see if this amp has ever been worked on. Some cobwebs were hanging out in unwanted places. Now, this is the kind of thing that everyone would really want to know before buying one of these amps. And not every seller is capable of even getting it to this point. A lot of guys, once that obstruction was run into getting the chassis out of the cabinet, might have given up or might have used force and caused some damage to either the cabinet or the chassis, or both. Or they charge you extra to do what I'm about to do, or complain if you want to do that. But I think it's very important for you to know that, hey, if you buy a 1978-79 Super Reverb, all may not be well underneath here. In fact, even if it looks okay, it probably needs to be changed out. Let's see what's underneath. All right. It doesn't want to come up. That means the adhesive on the little foam rubber strip that they put in here is stuck to the cap, so it's probably going to have original capacitors. Yep. I'm looking at them. I don't see any bulges. That does not mean that they're any good. Bulges just means that failure is imminent. But it's not like caps are great, they're great, they're great, they're great, they fail. In a lot of ways, it's like a 9-volt battery. It's very briefly 9 volts. It spends most of its life around 8.5 volts. Drops down very slowly to about 7 volts, and then there's a steady decline. Much like it is with capacitors. Once that battery dips below 7 volts, it's no longer a 9-volt battery, even if it has not failed. Even if it hasn't leaked a whole bunch of yuck inside your flashlight or your remote, it has every intention of doing so. So these caps have not leaked in your flashlight yet, but they are on the path. They're depressingly old. 78, 79 doesn't seem like that long ago to me, but I was 7 and now I'm 51. So I guess reality says otherwise. They're going to need to be changed, even if they're not at imminent risk of blowing up. Let's take a look inside the rest of the amp. Everything is exactly as I would expect to find it in a 78-ish Super Reverb. Got the death cap over here. Got the spaghetti everywhere. This amp is all original. It really needs all these cathode bypass caps changed out. 78, the board had heavy wax that can easily become conductive. All the metal's got a white oxide powder. It's a zinc oxide. It's called white rust. It wipes off pretty easily. Just a little bit of isopropyl or WD-40 on a paper towel will get rid of it. This hum balance pot in this era Fender often fails because it makes ground through a tiny little ground lug held onto the chassis by the pot, and that hardware becomes loose and oxidizes over time. Aside from that, it's a lot of current to expect that pot to handle. They don't always hold up to the task. Everything in here is original. I would guess that this amp is safe for me to power on, but not optimal. I'm looking at the screen grid resistors here. I'm not seeing anything which has failed. The owner said one of the volumes was noisy. Please clean, check condition of amp, call with estimate. So this video will also be an estimate that I can share with him. Let me see which volume pot he's reporting the issue with. I'm going to power this up on my current limiter and see what it sounds like. See what it sounds like. Hear what it sounds like. We'll see if we have any magic smoke. Well, I didn't have to look at the ticket. As soon as I turned this volume pot, I saw the whole thing moving. It's very, very loose. Let's see if this is a push-on or a set screw. It's a push-on knob. Let me get my knob puller. I'm going to tighten this up like Archie Bell. It's a little bit tricky to do this era of silver face amps, as the silver panel is actually on a higher plane than the nuts sit on. So sometimes the proper tool doesn't quite fit and I've got to use what works. This is a lot of fun on my wrist right now, I'll tell you what. That knob is tight. I'm not going to put the knob back on yet, just in case the pot's bad. A lot of resistance there. I expect we'll be cleaning those out with deoxit. The ticket says volume loose, crackling. So, volume loose fixed. Let me check the other one. The other one seems okay. Let's power it on. Got my light bulb limiter in case anything's wrong. And I've got its 4x10 cabinet hooked up as a load because I know it's 2 ohms at least. I don't know if it sounds any good, but it should be safe for the output transformer. Well, it all comes up to temperature and operating voltage. Let me grab a Strat. I have signal generators. I use signal generators. I learn more about amps with instruments. And I'm sure it's much more enjoyable for you guys to listen to even my playing on a Strat than to hear nothing but sine wave 1Ks and 400 hertzes and such. Actually, let me not plug all the way in just yet. I want to make sure that those jacks are shunting properly. Taking it out of standby and watch my current limiter. All right, just a very dim bulb, glow in the bulb. That's good. I'm gonna leave it like that for just a moment. Make sure there aren't any spikes as things pass signal and the current demands change. Let me bring the master volume all the way up. Now bring the channel volume up. Yeah, a lot of rushing water. I suspect that's probably a tube, so we're not even going to plug in yet. Put it in standby. Actually, no, let me see what's happening on channel 1 first. Channel 1 is nice. So we're going to swap V1 and V2 and see if the problem moves from channel 1 to channel 2. In which case it's a bad tube. This is the era of the international Mullard tubes and fenders, which can be fine tubes when they work, but no tubes are forever, no matter how much that guy on eBay charged you. So same kind of tube was in V1 and was quiet there. We're going to put it in V2, see if the noise leaves the reverb channel. Take it out of standby, bring the volume up. Now we just have that hum. Okay, the rushing water is gone, so we just had a bad tube in V2. And that hum, I think, might just be non-normaling jacks. Where's my little insulated pointer? So people aren't mean to me on the internet about touching discharge caps with metal tools. All right, it's not just a non-shunting thing. Let me plug in the guitar and see if it goes away. All right. I'm suspicious that we have a bad ground to chassis there. So let me put it in standby and make sure all the input jacks are really tight and the solder joints on them are not broken. They were not really tight. They're flexing a little bit as I tighten them, which means I'm going to need to redo the solder joints a little bit because they get strained as the jacks move. I'm not the first person to strain those solder joints. If you let those jacks get loose and you gig with them for a while, that's when the big strain happens. All right, while my soldering iron comes to temp, let's see if that changes anything. There's also all the spaghetti here in this area that's not optimal, but there's just no difference between that jack making contact with the point which should be ground and not. But if I take a metal tool, touch chassis and touch the tip, that's what we should be hearing. We've got a bad input jack. The shunt is not grounding well. But again, that may be solder joints. So let me reflow that. I'll try to do it on camera. It's a kind of awkward angle for me to reach. If necessary, I'll take the jacks out and do it. All right, those jacks need to come out. Let me power the amp fully off and put it out of standby. So all the caps will drain through the voltage balance resistors in the amp. So let's see why these jacks are not shunting to ground. All right, so I got this jack separated. I got that nasty solder out. And if I move this open, force this to be open, I measure 1 mega across this resistor, which is good. But if it's closed, it's only getting 80 to 100 ohms continuity to ground, or what would be ground from the sleeve to the tip through the shunt. So I have got it open, and I have sprayed some deoxit there. I've got some 800 grit wet dry in there, and I've just closed the shunt. I'm just going to do that. And I'm going to plug the cable back in, which I dropped, which opens it back up. And I'm going to do the same thing to burnish the other side. First I did the tip, now I'm doing the shunt. And that 800 grit should, in conjunction with that deoxit, should remove that funk. At this point, this should measure 0 ohms from tip to shunt, which is tied to the sleeve. If that's the case, I'll put it all back together. If that's not the case, there's something else with the jack. A new Switchcraft jack is not expensive, and it's not worth wasting too much time on, but if that cleaning did the trick, we'll be good to go. So now, with nothing plugged in, 0.7 ohms, which is pretty much what my meter measures because I've got a meter in need of a little bit of minor calibration. So I'm going to put all this back together, and that hum should be gone. All right, here's the hum we did have. I'm holding the shunt open. That hum's gone. The amp's still not that quiet, but it is much better. And the remaining hum in the background, I can do nothing about unless the owner authorizes need to replace those filter caps. That's one of the symptoms of old filter caps. Now that mids pot is dirty. I'll give that a little quick spray. I've got the nozzle on the deoxit set to dispense a very small amount at once, so I'm not being as wasteful as it may look. And the base pot. Sorry, I keep getting thrown off because I can't see the volume pot because its knob is off. So treble, mid, bass, reverb. It's going to be noisy with the no tank attached, but no crackle. And the tremolo is not going to be doing anything. See how the master volume does. Mechanical sounds from the pot itself having some resistance, but nothing coming through the speaker. We put this in standby. Since we have one bad tube, I'm going to move the tube that's in V2 to V1, and we're going to check out the normal channel, see how it's doing. So let's bring up its volume. We don't have any issue with the shunts on those jacks, so I'll still clean the contacts. The volume pot sounds fine. Treble. Mids, again, having some noise. Later, after the deoxit evaporates, I'll put in some fader lube. One to clean, one to lubricate. They're different things. All right, so that's good. Now we can plug the guitar in. We'll check the normal channel at least before I move the tubes over. Actually, I'm going to grab a spare 12AX7 and pop it in V1. Here's an RCA, pop it in V2. Here's an RCA out of my stash. That ought to be good for this test. And we'll see how the normal channel works. Aside from the background hum and things not being quite as strong and clear as they should be, which is going to all be down to the filter caps and old cathode bypass caps. Not hearing many issues on that. So let's go to the reverb channel. That all seems good. Let's see if the tremolo works. So far, while the amp does need all new electrolytic caps, aside from the input jacks and dirty pots and the loose volume, this amp's in real good shape for the era. And these are all things that I expect to find in an original 78, 79 Fenders. So it's not like this is some outlier. This is what most of them are like when they come into me, unless they've been gone too far and the caps have caught on fire. Took a long time for that tremolo to come on. Better now. What that is the old cathode bypass caps. There are two of them in that tremolo circuit, and they need to be changed up. They're taking a long time to charge up initially. If I were to turn off the tremolo for 5 minutes and do that again, it'd be that same slow ramp up to tremolo. So that doesn't tell me anything other than the rest of the circuit is healthy. Those caps need to be changed out. I expected that. Let me hook up a reverb tank. This is not my usual test tank. I ended up sending that out with that Princeton because the owner didn't want to wait for a replacement to arrive. So the replacement's arriving for me. This is a little 9-inch tank of suitable impedance. It'll work fine, but it's a shorter tank than the usual one. But I just need to confirm the reverb circuit is good. I think that would make anyone happy. Actually, that little tank sounds pretty good in this. The reason I was cautious about it being, I really wanted to check that, is the AT7 in this is an old Philips, which is a wonderful thing. But in the late 70s Fenders, they changed the cathode on the driver's stage from a 2.2K that's bypassed, with a full bypass, to a 470 ohm, and sometimes a 680 ohm unbypassed. I'm not going to get into particulars of why they thought that was a good idea, other than it saved them a 20-cent capacitor, but it drives the tubes too hard and they have high failure rates, and that resistor often smokes as a result. It's just a lot of current for a half-watt resistor. So if the owner approves work beyond what I've done now to make the jacks work and the pots not make noise, and hopefully he will. I'd love to restore this. That's one of the things I like to do on these, is I change that to the pre-early 70s circuit. I change it to the AB763. Better this time. I think the owner is going to be very happy. Recapping one of these is not tremendously expensive. Let me do one other check while I have it here on the bench and see if we have any big buildup of DC in the wax on the board itself. That primarily happens when amps were used a lot in smoke-filled bars, and the boards get hot and the wax gets soft and all the smoke in the atmosphere settles down to that soft wax. Then the amp's turned off, it cools off, the wax hardens, all the particles are trapped. Repeat that every weekend for 50 years and you can get some really conductive boards. But if amps were not used in those honky-tonk environments, that's not so much of a problem. I'm not measuring much appreciable DC on the wax board, so that's good. This node's often problematic. It only has 30 millivolts, that's great. This cap here often gets leaks. Nothing. Let's check the tone stacks. Nothing. Nothing, nothing. This does not have many of the big problems this era of silver panel waxed board fenders often has. So this would be a pretty straightforward recap, and this amp would be good for another, other people would say good for another 40, 50 years. I have to be honest. Caps are designed to last 12 to 20 years. So call it 12 to 15. If he pays me about, it's going to be close to $400 with parts included. That's 3 to 4 hours of labor and parts. That includes a new power cable, all new caps, done properly, the flaw in the reverb circuit corrected to the 60s stuff, making sure that, that's one new preamp tube at least. These output tubes seem fine. They're not microphonic, making sure that they're biased right. And then making, the speakers sound fantastic. So it may be only 3 hours of labor, not 4. And parts aren't that expensive. So I don't know what he paid for, but at the beginning of this video, I said, pretend that you bought one of these based on my amps under $1,000 video, and you got this for $950. And after spending $350, $400 on it, you're into it for about $1,200, $1,300. I wouldn't be too mad about that, because this is, if you need a big 60, 70 watt 4x10, here you go. You got it. It's world class. If you want to pay me a little extra, I can go in here, not a little extra, it's quite a bit of work, but I could go in here, spend another 2 hours and clean up all this spaghetti and make some changes that would get you a lot closer to the sound of the 60s amps. And you would have an amp that functionally, in most ways, would be equivalent to a 1965 for 2/3 to half the price. I'm not sure what the market value on a 65, 66 Super Reverb is, but it's a lot more than $1,000 most of the time for ones that are even in this good shape, let alone after this one's been recapped. So if after watching this video, and the soon-to-come amps under 1,000 larger video, you are interested in buying a vintage Fender because, hey, for the same price as a new reissue, I can get this actual old one. Remember that this amp is in pretty typical condition electrically as far as what it needs to keep going. Some have already been recapped. Some are going to be in terrible shape and need a lot more work than this. And without looking inside or having a tech look at photos, and most of those photos are not on the Reverb listings, you cannot know. So I would recommend buying from a dealer with a good policy on returns or problems, especially if the dealer has a tech on hand who could open it up and give it an inspection for you. Or, if you're going to spend $1,000 or more on an amplifier, see if a local tech might meet you to evaluate the amp, or if you could buy it with a return policy and then bring it straight to them and have them check it out. You spend $150 having a tech go through it, you can save yourself a lot of money potentially. And there are things that you wouldn't know about, such as the things I pointed out with the power cable or that reverb driver cathode. But the tech may say, hey, all it needs is to have the input jacks properly cleaned, which I just showed you how to do. So it has to be your choice as to whether this is a good investment for you. But, say that you bought this amp and it was $950. By the time it's really ready to be used, it's a $1,300 amp. If something major is wrong with it, it could be a $1,600 amp. These are the things you have to bear in mind. But if all the stars align, it can be a fantastic choice that will last you for decades with proper care and maintenance.